There are questions that never announce themselves. They sit quietly, unanswered, waiting behind polite smiles and ordinary routines. They live in the pauses between text messages, in the spaces where something should have been said, but wasn't. In this story, what matters most is not what Chris Watts confessed to. It's what he never explained. Not the violence, but the silence that came before it. This is not a retelling of a crime scene. It is an attempt to understand how absence can grow powerful enough to erase an entire family. Before we begin, welcome to this channel. Here, we don't rush to judgment or chase shock. We examine behavior, patterns, and quiet decisions, because truth doesn't always announce itself loudly. If this kind of careful, victim-centered storytelling matters to you, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps keep these stories remembered, not consumed. Now, let's begin where the answers stop. In the days after Shannon Watts and her children vanished, Chris Watts spoke often. He spoke to police. He spoke to neighbors. He spoke to the media. But none of those words explained why. His voice remained level. His posture relaxed. His eyes dry. What unsettled investigators wasn't panic, it was the absence of it. There was no urgency in his tone, no desperation in his movements. Only a man standing in a driveway, pleading calmly for his family to come home, as if they had simply stepped out for groceries. That calm would become the first crack. To the outside world, the Watts family looked relentlessly ordinary, almost aspirational. Social media told a clear story: smiling children, carefully framed family photos, milestone celebrations documented with cheerful captions. Shannon was expressive, optimistic, openly committed to building a life she believed in. She filmed updates, shared struggles, and spoke about marriage as something that required effort, but also faith. Chris, by contrast, appeared mostly as a supporting presence: quiet, helpful, reliable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't object. He didn't contradict. And that, in retrospect, is what made the image so convincing. Perfection doesn't always function as deception. Sometimes it works as camouflage. Behind the curated posts, there were details that didn't trend or collect likes. Financial strain, documented but rarely discussed publicly. Mounting debt. Missed payments. A life maintained through effort rather than stability. Shannon acknowledged these pressures. She talked about rebuilding, about moving forward together. Her instinct was engagement, problem-solving, communication, visibility. Chris's instinct was withdrawal. Not dramatic withdrawal. Not explosive anger. Just quiet retreat. People close to the family would later describe him as easygoing, non-confrontational, the kind of guy who never complained. But those traits, when paired with long-term stress, can become something else entirely. Avoidance isn't peace. It's postponement. And postponement accumulates interest. In the months leading up to the murders, Chris began to change, but only in ways that were easy to dismiss. He lost weight, started exercising intensely, paid more attention to his appearance. On the surface, these were improvements, self-care, motivation. But internally, something was narrowing. His conversations shortened. His responses slowed. His emotional range flattened. When Shannon reached out, through texts, calls, attempts to reconnect, his replies grew increasingly minimal. Not cruel, just distant. Distance can feel survivable. Until it is. Shannon sensed it. Her messages, preserved in phone records, show a woman trying to bridge a widening gap, asking questions, expressing concern, seeking reassurance. She wanted clarity. Chris offered ambiguity. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He let silence do the work. This imbalance, between someone reaching forward and someone stepping back, would become central to everything that followed. Then there was the fantasy. It didn't announce itself dramatically. It arrived quietly, as fantasies often do. A relationship with a coworker. An imagined future without financial pressure, without marital responsibility, without the visible weight of fatherhood. In this alternate emotional world, Chris was lighter, unburdened, unobserved. There were no school schedules, no bills, no expectations to explain himself. Fantasy doesn't replace reality all at once. It erodes it gradually, until the real world feels unbearable by comparison. What's important here is not the affair itself, but what it represented. To Chris, this wasn't just desire. It was escape. An escape in his mind began to feel like a solution. By the time Shannon left for a short trip to visit family, the emotional distance had hardened. Chris was already living in two worlds, one silent and strained, the other imagined and effortless. When Shannon returned home in the early hours of August 13, 2018, she walked back into a house filled with unresolved tension, but no visible warning of what was about to happen. There was no argument overheard, no disturbance reported. What occurred inside that home would later be described clinically, briefly, without emotion. But the decision behind it had been forming for months. This was not a moment of lost control. It was an exit. The children, Bella and Celeste, are remembered now through routine. Bedtime rituals, morning hugs, the way they ran to the door. In the weeks before their deaths, caregivers and family members noticed subtle changes, missed affection, less engagement, a father who was present but not connected. Absence doesn't always look like disappearance. Sometimes it looks like silence in the same room. When Shannon and the children were reported missing, Chris complied fully with law enforcement. Too fully. He answered questions without hesitation. Volunteered details unprompted. Maintained a steady emotional tone. Investigators are trained to notice distress, but also its absence. His timeline shifted slightly with each retelling. His language distanced him from events. Not "I did," but they were gone. The words didn't implicate. They deflected. As evidence mounted, phone records, GPS data, surveillance footage, the psychological narrative collapsed into something unavoidable. This was not an impulsive act. It required planning, sequencing, follow-through, control. When confronted with irrefutable evidence, Chris confessed, but his confession was fragmented, incomplete. He admitted to actions, not to understanding. Even in confession, he avoided full emotional ownership. In court, prosecutors reframed the story away from drama and toward clarity. They outlined choices, timelines, deliberate acts. They emphasized that this was not an accident, not provoked, not the result of temporary insanity. It was entitlement, the belief that one's desire for escape outweighed the lives of others. Explanation was offered. Justification was not. What lingers after this case is not the violence, but the recognition. That silence can be lethal. That avoidance can become a weapon. That some crimes are not explosions, but exits carefully chosen by someone who believes they deserve a different life. Chris Watts did not lose control. He exercised it. The hidden files in this case, the texts, the financial records, the behavioral patterns, do not change what happened. But they change how we understand it. They remind us that danger doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives smiling, compliant, quiet, and by the time the silence breaks, it's already too late. Shannon Watts is remembered not for how she died, but for how fiercely she tried to hold her family together. Bella and Celeste are remembered in laughter, not in headlines. Their lives mattered long before they became a case. As you leave this story, consider this. Who is withdrawing quietly around you? Who is being silenced by avoidance rather than anger? If this narrative resonated with you, share your reflections below. Thoughtful discussion keeps these stories from becoming just content. And if you believe careful storytelling can create awareness, not fear, consider supporting this channel. We don't tell these stories to relive tragedy. We tell them so silence doesn't get the last word. The story does not end with a sentence handed down in court. It never does. After the plea, after the headlines faded, after Chris Watts was transferred into the quiet permanence of prison, the case continued to live, silently, in documents, recordings, and fragments of behavior that resisted simple explanation. These are the hidden files. Not secret in the conspiratorial sense, but overlooked in the emotional rush to close the door and move on. They are made of emails no one wanted to reread. Psychological evaluations skimmed for conclusions. Letters written after conviction, when there was no advantage left to gain, only control to maintain. And control even then mattered. In prison, Chris Watts did something that unsettled many who followed the case. He talked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but selectively. He granted interviews, wrote letters, participated in conversations with investigators months after sentencing. And what emerged was not remorse, but revision. Details shifted, motives softened, responsibility blurred. The violence was acknowledged, but the decision behind it remained elusive. Even in captivity, he resisted full psychological exposure. Silence once again did the work. One of the most revealing patterns in these post-conviction communications is not what Chris said, but how he framed himself. He positioned his actions as something that happened, rather than something he chose. Language matters here. I snapped. I wasn't myself. It was like something else took over. These phrases offer relief, from guilt, from clarity, from accountability. But when placed alongside months of documented withdrawal, planning, and emotional disengagement, they collapse. This was not a break from character. It was its quietest expression. Psychologists who later reviewed the case noted something consistent across interviews and records: emotional detachment paired with entitlement. Not grandiose entitlement. Not narcissism in its loudest form. But something subtler. The belief that discomfort was unjust. That dissatisfaction required resolution. That escape was deserved. This mindset does erupt. It calculates. Consider the way Chris described his family after the fact. He spoke of them fondly, but distantly. As memories. As symbols. Not as people whose inner worlds continued to exist independent of him. This emotional flattening wasn't new. It was present long before August 2018. In missed conversations, unanswered questions, deferred responsibility. The crime was not the beginning of the detachment. It was its conclusion. For Shannon's family, the aftermath unfolded differently. They were not given the luxury of emotional distance. They reviewed autopsy reports, sat through hearings, answered questions they should never have had to answer. And yet, they consistently redirected attention back to who Shannon was before she became a victim. A daughter, a sister, a mother who documented joy not because it was perfect, but because she was trying to hold on to it. Her optimism has often been misunderstood as denial. But optimism is not ignorance, It is effort. What makes this case linger is not its brutality, but its familiarity. There was no masked intruder, no chaotic crime scene, just a family home, a quiet neighborhood, a man who blended in. This is why the psychological elements matter more than the physical ones. Because the warning signs were not screams. They were silences. Financial records tell one version of the story. Mounting debt. Loans taken to sustain an image of progress. But financial pressure alone does not lead to murder. What matters is how that pressure was processed. Shannon confronted it directly, seeking solutions, sharing burdens, reaching outward. Chris internalized it, retreating, avoiding, imagining release. Two people under the same stress, moving in opposite emotional directions. That divergence is critical. The affair, often sensationalized, becomes less important when viewed psychologically. It was not about passion. It was about erasure. In the fantasy life Chris constructed, there were no children needing reassurance. No wife asking for honesty. No past debts or future obligations. Just the self unburdened. Fantasy doesn't demand accountability. Reality does. One of the most disturbing elements in later interviews is how Chris spoke about the future he imagined. He described it plainly. Without guilt. A life that simply began again. As if history could be edited out. This reveals something essential. He did not see himself as a destroyer, but as someone starting over. That perception requires a profound dehumanization of others. Not hatred. Irrelevance. In many violent crimes, rage dominates the narrative. Here it does not. There is no record of explosive arguments. No neighbors reporting shouting. No friends describing escalating hostility. Instead, there is compliance, accommodation, withdrawal. This is why framing this crime as a snap does not hold. Nothing snapped. Something receded. Investigators later acknowledged that what initially unsettled them most was not inconsistency, but calm. Chris did not display the physiological markers of acute distress expected in a parent whose family had vanished. He was cooperative but detached, helpful but uninvested. As evidence mounted, this emotional flatness became impossible to ignore. It wasn't fear of being caught. It was relief that the performance was ending. Even in prison, that emotional economy continues. Chris reads religious texts, speaks about forgiveness, positions himself as transformed. Transformation narratives are powerful, but transformation requires confrontation. And confrontation requires numbing the truth without dilution. That has never fully happened. What then do the hidden files change? They don't alter the facts of the crime. They deepen the understanding of how such a crime can occur without warning. They show us that danger does not always wear aggression on its surface. Sometimes it wears indifference. For those who followed the case closely, there is often an impulse to search for the real motive. Was it money? Was it the affair? Was it resentment? The answer is less specific and more unsettling. It was the desire to disappear responsibility without consequence. That desire, when paired with emotional avoidance and entitlement, becomes lethal. This is not a story about a monster hiding in plain sight. It is a story about a man who never learned how to confront discomfort honestly and chose erasure instead. Monsters feel distant. This does not. Shannon's legacy is often reduced to the final weeks of her life. But those who knew her remember persistence, her willingness to speak openly, to ask hard questions, to keep believing in repair. She was not naive. She was committed. That distinction matters. Bella and Celeste are remembered through ordinary tenderness. The way Bella's personality was gentle, observant. The way Celeste's energy filled rooms. Their lives were not symbols. They were experiences. And their absence is measured not by what happened to them, but by everything that never will. In reflecting on this case, investigators and psychologists alike have emphasized a difficult truth. Prevention is not about predicting violence. It's about recognizing withdrawal. When communication collapses. When avoidance replaces engagement. When fantasy becomes preferable to accountability. These are not guarantees, but they are warnings. Silence is often misread as calm. Compliance as peace. But silence can be a rehearsal. An emotional disengagement that allows harm to feel abstract. By the time harm becomes real, the emotional groundwork has already been laid. The Watts case forces us to sit with discomfort. Not because it is shocking, but because it is plausible. It challenges the idea that violence must look violent before it happens. It doesn't. Sometimes it looks like distance, like fatigue, like someone slowly stepping away from their own life. There is no lesson here that offers comfort, only awareness. That communication matters not because it prevents conflict, but because it prevents isolation. That accountability must be practiced before it is demanded. That leaving, emotionally, psychologically, can be as dangerous as staying in rage. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life confined. But confinement is not the same as reckoning. That work remains unfinished. And perhaps it always will. What remains finished and irrevocable are the lives lost. Not as a cautionary tale, but as individuals whose existence mattered long before this story was told. As you think about this case, resist the urge to simplify it. There is no single moment to point to. No singular cause. Only patterns. And patterns are what we must learn to see. If this story has stayed with you, let it do more than disturb. Let it sharpen awareness. Talk about emotional withdrawal. Take silence seriously. Value clarity over comfort. And if you believe that careful, respectful storytelling keeps victims from being forgotten, leave your thoughts below. Your voice adds weight to remembrance. We don't revisit these cases to relive horror. We revisit them to understand how quietly it can begin, and how much is lost when it goes unnoticed. Some crimes are not explosions. They are exits. And once taken, they cannot be undone.